Adaptive Leader webinar series organized by the Center for Asia Leadership. My name is Faustino John Lim, and today's webinar is on how to communicate and inspire in times of uncertainty with our speaker, Ami Valdemoro. We have launched this webinar series during this crisis we are all facing, whether you are in business, government, or nonprofit, to bring the insights and ideas from the Center for Asia Leadership Faculty Network in a way that is useful and accessible to all of you. I am pleased to welcome over 400 registrants from over 26 countries, and it looks like we are coming from nearly every continent, perhaps except Antarctica, and representing so many different industries. Thank you guys so much for your support, and we hope that this webinar series is adding value to you. If you are joining us for the first time, our center is an organization based out of Boston, United States, and Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, operating in several cities across Asia. We are founded at Harvard University among fellows and alumni, and we are focused on helping leaders in Asia initiate change and manage progress in their organizations and communities. We are in the midst of a 20-week series with 20 topics, and the purpose of these webinars is really to encourage and educate during these uncertain times. The topic of today's webinar is actually aligned with in-person and online workshops which we run, and we are glad that we are able to offer these previews in a webinar format to provide some value to you during this time. I would now like to recognize our speaker. Joining us from the Philippines, Ami Valdemoro is the chief riveter of the Moxie Gal Collective. I wonder what that means. So she has a training, which is a training and coaching platform for mission-driven women. So maybe Ami can tell us about that a bit later. She is a former development consultant, and she is, of course, a Center for Asia Leadership teaching faculty. So Ami, welcome to the program.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. And hello to everyone from all around the world. Thank you for sharing your time with us.
And so what is a chief riveter exactly do?
So Moxie really means guts or courage or determination. And I think the world could use a bit more Moxie now. And it's inspired from a term that was used during World War II, right? You had to have Moxie to be able to survive and thrive. And it's the same time that produced Rosie the Riveter, that iconic image of a woman who had her sleeves rolled up and was ready to get down to work. So that's why I am the chief riveter of the Moxie Gal Collective.
Okay, got it. Oh, yeah, I didn't know it was connected to that one image of that with her bulging bicep, right? That lady. So in this session, we will start with a poll and then get right into the presentation with Ami, where she will spend about 20 minutes or so focusing on these three core questions. After that, we will have an open forum Q&A, and then we'll just wrap up and end with a post-webinar survey. So, poll time. Please participate by voting. What is your favorite movie or television genre? And this might seem a bit off topic, but Ami will share later how this is actually related to her topic and her presentation. Okay, wow, we have a huge, we've got a majority of our participants, over 50%, who like action and adventure. Second, comedy. Okay, the last is horror and thriller. Okay, so keep these in mind, Ami. All right, so let me just introduce the topic, and then I'll pass it over to Ami. No one can argue that perks and privileges are usually associated with being the leader. But more often than not, what you get with leadership is the opposite. Leadership is often a heavy burden, and for some people these days, they may even consider it a curse. And why is that? It's because it seems we are only safely in charge when we have all of the solutions. At a time like this, when we're faced with humongous problems which we have to deal with, for which there exist no solutions yet, it requires difficult phases of learning and difficult change for ourselves and for the people that we lead. So, while in the words of Heifetz and Linsky, we try to stay alive through the dangers of change, how might we help and communicate to our teams and organizations to help them thrive in the face of uncertainty. Public narrative is one such communication framework, one such tool that we can use. So my first question to Ami is, what is public narrative and how can it help us communicate and lead during times of uncertainty? Ami, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John. Thank you, John, and thanks to everyone again for joining us in this opportunity to share about public narrative. Now, as John mentioned, I can think of no more important or critical time than the one we are living in now to think about how we might adapt or evolve as leaders. Leadership is accepting responsibility to enable others to achieve purpose in a time of uncertainty. And I can think of no more relevant time than the present to think about this practice. Now, when we're thinking about the practice of leadership, we might be thinking about it in two different ways. Now, you might have participated in the Center for Asia Leadership's other webinars or other learning seminars where you have learned new skills or tools or competencies around how to practice leadership, right? The how questions. These are questions about strategy. So they form one component of a leadership practice. The other component is around answering why questions. Why is it that we are called to act? Why is it that we're called to act now? And these are questions that are answered by narrative or stories. Stories draw upon our emotions and show our values in action. They help us to feel what matters rather than just telling us what matters. And because stories allow us to express these values as lived experience and not just as an abstract principle, they have the power to move others to take action, which is what the practice of leadership is about and what we're going to focus on today. May I have the next slide, please? So public narrative is a practice, right, that allows leaders to engage collective of people in taking action on something that they care about. Now, the reason why we had asked you what your favorite movie or television genre is was to get you in the mindset of the stories that appeal most to you. And I'm very happy to know that I have a lot of fellow action and adventure fans among us. Right? So each of the stories that we think about has a particular framework. We meet a character. If I could see the next slide, please. We meet a character or characters who are confronted with a challenge that they might not have anticipated. A challenge like many of you are facing right now, right? With this pandemic, or maybe other challenges that you're viewing in your organizations from where you sit. And these challenges present us with choice points. Do I take the red pill or do I take the blue pill? Do I dive down the rabbit hole? And depending on what choices we make, that will lead to a certain outcome. And that outcome will teach us the moral of the story. We can think about texts from faith traditions, right? Stories from faith traditions, or bedtime stories that we tell our children. These are examples of stories, and the art of storytelling has existed for as long as humans have existed. Public narrative is a very specific way of telling stories in order to mobilize people to take action. Next slide, please. And they do this by tapping into certain emotions. There are certain emotions that we may have been feeling in the context of how we are dealing with this pandemic or any challenge that we're confronted with as leaders. Certain emotions that inhibit us from taking action. Public narrative is geared towards creating stories that move people from inaction to action. For example, how might we think about stories that we can create to move people from a sense of inertia, where you're just on autopilot or doing things out of habit, you're stagnant and not moving, into a sense of urgency, right? That there is something that needs to be done and it needs to be done now, and we need to be the ones to do it. How might we craft stories, for example, that take us from a sense of apathy, that we just don't care about the outcome into a sense of anger. Now, since we have action and adventure fans, it's not Incredible Hulk type anger. Right? This is anger in the sense of indignation at the gap between where we are now, our current reality, and where we think we ought to be. How can we move people into that sense of wanting to take charge and create a new narrative? How might we move people from a sense of fear? There's a lot of fear around health, safety, job security, the profitability of business, the ability to sustain business. How might we use stories to move from that place of fear to a place of hope through concrete small actions that we're taking to help with the health and safety of workers, to ensure that we can stay viable, right, as a business or as an organization? How might we create stories around moving from a sense of isolation, which is very real, right? The sense of physical, social distancing from people? How might we move people from that sense of isolation to feeling a sense of solidarity, that even though we might have to be physically distant from one another for a period of time, that we are still part of a larger collective that has a sense of purpose and solidarity with one another? And then finally, how might we move ourselves from stories or emotions in which we are feelings of self-doubt? Am I going to be able to adapt or innovate into this changing time? A lot of companies or organizations are thinking about how to move in the digital space and are not sure whether they are going to be capable of doing that. How might we create stories to shift that feeling of self-doubt into a feeling that you can make a difference? This is the work of public narrative. Now, public narrative has three specific components, three different stories that you can craft that, when woven together, can inspire groups of people to act or pursue change or adapt. The first story that we start with in public narrative is a story of self. And this is really about your story in the position that you sit where you're exercising leadership. What is it that calls you to lead in this moment of uncertainty? What are the choices that you're confronted with in your position of leadership? What are the challenges that you're facing, and what choices do you have? What choices would you like to make, and what is the outcome that you would like to see from those choices? Right? Because that outcome is going to indicate the values that are important to you as a leader. From the story of self, we move into the story or stories of us, which is moving from the individual to the community. And these stories, and there can be multiple stories, are about talking about the shared history or shared experience of this group of people and the values that you share. Because it's one thing to identify you and where you sit and your values as a leader, but in order to move people, they have to also be able to relate to you and to know that you share values together. What's important to you, what motivates you. So that's what the story of us is focused on. And then from the story of us, we move into a story of now, which is really about where you talk about the concrete tactics, strategies, and action that you would like to take. This is the story of what you're calling people to do. It ends with a specific call to action and a sense of urgency around why you need to take action now. What is at stake if you don't take action? What is to be gained by taking action? And since we're operating in a context where there is a lot of uncertainty and there are losses, what might we be losing and how might we honor those losses? This is the general framework, and it was developed by Marshall Ganz, who is a professor at Harvard, who started his career as a community organizer. But this is applicable in all contexts, not just contexts of public service, right? And we will see some examples of this in the next section.
Ami, thank you for that introduction to public narrative. And I love how it codifies what, when I first learned about public narrative, what I loved about it is that it codified basically the best speeches, the best communicators, and the techniques that they used all into like a framework. And thank you for that introduction. So help us understand some of the framework and how it can be illustrated, how it is demonstrated by business or government leaders who have used it perhaps recently.
So I thought the most useful way to answer this in the context in which we're living is to present 3 examples. One example of a story of self, an example of a story of us, and an example of a story of now. Now, the first example is a story of self from Prime Minister Lee of Singapore. Now, Prime Minister Lee has been hosting regular chats with his constituents in which he gives updates about the government's response to the pandemic and where he sees action moving forward in the future. Now, in this particular example, I have taken an excerpt from a talk that he gave in which he makes a specific appeal to older Singaporeans. And his story of self actually blends with the story of us in the sense that he says outright, he says, I am one of you. I know how you feel. And then he starts to talk about the practices and traditions that are important to older Singaporeans, right? Things like visiting grandchildren, pursuing familiar routines, hosting karaoke groups, socializing. These are all things that are important to this particular group of Singaporeans, right? And by naming these values and these practices and these traditions out loud, he will then move towards a call to action, which is around having people stay at home in order to protect their loved ones. The next story is around the story of us, right? And this story comes from, if I can see the next slide, please, comes from the Philippines and from the president and COO of San Miguel Corporation, one of the largest conglomerates in the Philippines, Mr. Ramon S. Ang. And instead of being a video presentation, this is taken from an article with one of the major newspapers here. And this story of us is really hitting at the shared values of the us's that Mr. Ang is talking about in the article. He starts out by saying, we are not exempt from this crisis as a company, right? But he declares in the first paragraph, the safety and security of our workforce comes first. He names the value outright. He then goes on to talk about this concept of malasakit, which for those of you who are not familiar, right? Malasakit doesn't actually have a very concrete translation in English, but it's about care and compassion, right, and stewardship. And malasakit is actually one of the core values that's not just written about in San Miguel, but imbued and lived by each of the 66,000 workers that make up this conglomerate. So Mr. Ang has a call to action as well, right? Please continue to adopt our malasakit mindset. Right? This is the value, the North Star that is going to continue to guide these employees through this time of crisis. He's appealing to their sense of malasakit that will carry them through into the next stage of the company. Our third example is a story of now that comes from New Zealand and Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who, like Prime Minister Lee, has been hosting regular communications with her constituents. Now, this is a little bit different. She used social media for this example. She's in her home, she's quite informally dressed, but she's responding to what she thinks the needs of her constituents are, which is to relate, for her to be able to relate to them where they are. She's asking them to, in this video, isolate for a number of weeks in order to help to break the chain. So when we're watching this video, it's a very short video. I'd like for you to zero in on what her specific call to action is and why she's asking, in this case, her constituents to make this specific action. What is it going to do to help move New Zealand forward into a particular outcome?
Evening, everyone. That I would jump online quickly and just check in with everyone, really, as we all prepare to hunker down for a few weeks. Excuse the casual attire. Can be a messy business putting toddlers to bed, so I'm not in my work clothes, so forgive me for that. I do just want to prepare everyone that because of the lag with COVID-19, the time from someone having contact with someone who has it, catching it themselves, them being symptomatic and being tested and positive, there's a number of days before all of that happens. So we won't see the positive benefits of all of the effort you're about to put in for self-isolation for a few days yet, quite a number of days. I'd say at least 10 days. So don't be disheartened. Our numbers are going to go up. And the modelling I've seen suggests that they will go up quite considerably. We'll see quite a steep rise. In fact, I'm expecting we may see several thousand cases over a period of time until we then will start to, we hope, see the effects of what we're doing with self-isolation having a positive impact. So don't be disheartened when you see that. Don't be disheartened when you see that ongoing increase because of that lag. All of the efforts that we're putting in should eventually show if we all follow the rules. Till then, do check in on your neighbours. Do especially check on those who may be elderly. Give them a call, see what their needs are, and if you can help them, go out and grab their essentials and pop them on the front door for them. Just remembering the way we can keep them safe is by keeping our distance. Remember, stay at home, break the chain, and you'll save lives. And it's as simple as that. That's everyone's job for the next 4 months.
So right, when Jacinda speaks, she says, stay at home, break the chain, look after your elderly neighbors, and if you can, bring them their essentials and leave them on their doorstep. That's 4 concrete actions that she's asking her constituents to take. Now, I offer these examples in a variety of different media, in a variety of different contexts, public sector, private sector, at home, in a variety of different situations to show you that there is no one particular way in which you can communicate your public narrative. There are different ways, right? But they're all effective in terms of getting people, mobilizing people to take action.
So Ami, thanks for sharing some of those political and business leaders and how they practice public narrative. Now, for us, for the viewers, what are some actually like very concrete things that we can practice immediately?
So the first thing I would say is to think about what your next opportunity for leadership is. Right? So I've given examples from public figures, from private sector individuals, but it might be that you are thinking about an opportunity for leadership in your personal context, in your home. The first step is to think about what your next opportunity for leadership is. Has it been scheduled? A lot of countries are now, if they haven't already come out of a community quarantine, they are, as in the case of the Philippines, going to start coming out of this quarantine, right? And so there is opportunity there in terms of trying to figure out when your next points of leadership, right? Your next opportunities for leadership are. So identify them. And then start to think about, in your position of leadership and how you are as a communicator, what is the best medium for you to use? Perhaps you're already using, right, social media, or perhaps you have regular addresses with your constituents, or maybe you have regular meetings, right? Whether Zoom meetings or physical meetings if you're able to meet physically. Identify those opportunities and those venues that you can use to use your public narrative. Okay? The next 3 kind of concrete takeaways are to write or articulate. Maybe you're not a writer, you can do a video recording or an audio recording of your story. Start with your story of self. As John mentioned at the beginning, particularly for leaders, where we are being asked to shepherd people through uncertainty, and it can feel very destabilizing. Writing a story of self can help to ground you as you continue to do your leadership work. It can remind you why you were called to serve. What is it that motivates you? And what is it that motivates you now in the context of this current challenge that we're facing? Write your story or stories of us. Who are the different us's that you want to reach? For some, it could be your board members. For some, it could be your leadership team. It might be your subordinates. For those who are in the public sector, right, it might be your constituents or nonprofit organizations. It could be your beneficiaries. Right? Identify the us's that you want to engage. And what are the common histories or the shared experiences that you already have? You have a shared history, and this might not be the first challenge or crisis that you have been through as a collective. What can you take from those experiences, those shared experiences, and the values that were instilled by those experiences to call people to action anew? And then write your story of now. What is it that you're asking people to do? This is where you have the marriage between your strategy and your narrative. By now, you've probably been thinking about what are the concrete steps, the small actions that you can take, for example, to ensure the health and safety and security of your workers. Or maybe it's a pivot to your business model. This is where you can communicate what you're going to ask people to do and why you're asking them to do it now. In Jacinda Ardern's speech, she also acknowledges that there may be losses as a result of this new path that they're going to pursue. It's okay to acknowledge those losses, particularly at a time like this. So once you've created these stories of self, of us, of now, the last perhaps takeaway is to practice. To practice, because this is, again, you be called upon to do through, and you might be repeatedly called upon to bring people together and to continue to mobilize them to take action slowly. I could see the next slide, please. So no two stories are going to be alike. And I've given you different examples from different media, different personalities, in order to encourage you to use public narrative no matter where you're sitting within your leadership position. You can still create a public narrative that is staying authentic to your own voice, that demonstrates competence, that is direct and forthcoming. Again, acknowledging the losses and the gains, right? We're operating in a context where there are going to be things that are lost. It might be life, right? It might be a loss of life. It could be the loss of a sense of the way things were, our previous modes of operating, which are a significant loss for people. But there's also an opportunity to tap into the best of your history, the best of your strengths and your experiences as a company or organization. And finally, this practice of leadership, whether using public narrative or not, can be an isolating exercise. Perhaps there are others, maybe not in your company or in your industry, people who you can rely on as confidants to help you, right, who might be having similar challenges and can help you to navigate through this crisis. This is, right, practicing walking the walk, of moving from isolation into feeling like you are part of a collective of people who are trying to make progress against this challenge. So I would encourage you to reach out to others who might be facing similar challenges and see how you might practice your narrative with them.
Ami, thank you for that. And we're going to go right into the questions. And for today's session, we're actually going to experiment with something new. So I see that some people have already submitted questions in the Q&A box. If there's a question that resonates with you, please upvote it, and Ami will do her best to to address that. But what we're going to do today is actually going to have the audience interact. If the Wi-Fi is maybe a bit shaky or the audio is not so good, then of course I will be the one to help facilitate it. But for now, we will just try to do this on our own. So our first question is actually from Ian Carlo Olegario. I accidentally put him in the answered column already, but his question is the following. So Ian, can we unmute Ian? Why don't you share which country you're from and then ask your question to Ami.
Hi. Hello, good morning. I'm Ian Carlo A. Oligario from the Philippines. I'm just interested to know about the effectiveness of the narrative approach. Here in the Philippines, as we all know, we have a president who is not so good in terms of delivering narratives. But in spite of that, he still enjoys overwhelming support from the people. So I'm just interested to know how we can gauge effectively the effectiveness of the narrative approach. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Ian, Carlo, and hello from down the street, I guess. It's a great question, right? At the beginning of the talk, I talked about the two kind of lenses through which we view leadership, the strategy and the narrative. And the truth is that one cannot exist without the other. Now, you gave a concrete example of an official in the public sector, right? And in a way, he has been effective at mobilizing a certain number of his constituents, right, around things that he cares about, which might not be the same things that other people care about. If you're talking about the context of a company, it's important to be able to outline concrete strategies, right, to name the numbers. Part of the us's you have to think about is whether people respond to kind of analytical approaches to things rather than just feelings. It cannot be one or the other, but you have to think about who it is that you're trying to mobilize and how you can effectively speak to them.
Okay, so our next question comes from Juancho Dulay Barreto. So can we unmute Juancho? Please share where you're from, which country you're from, and make sure that your question ends with a question mark.
Hi everyone. Hi Ami. I'm Juancho Dulay Barreto from Manila. So hello to you too. My question is, usually leaders want to project a position of strength to inspire confidence in their followers. However, of course, as we know, the pandemic has changed this. How vulnerable should leaders be? And is there a line to be drawn somewhere with regard to vulnerability?
Sure, that's a great question, Juancho. And hello again from probably down the street as I'm in Manila as well. So I think we have to be careful when we're talking about public narrative that this is not an opportunity for catharsis for a leader, right? This is not an opportunity for you to air your grievances or your vulnerabilities per se, right? People are looking to leaders or people in positions of leadership to provide, if we want to talk about maybe adaptive leadership, right? Direction, protection, and order. They're looking to you to be able to orient them so that they can find order in this uncertainty. Right? I think we've seen examples during this pandemic of leaders who have been able to talk about facts, but also to acknowledge that they don't know everything. Right? I think that is important to be able to say, that you don't have all the answers, but based on the information and the facts that you have, you believe that this is the best course of action. Now, I think that there's a separate conversation around how you can help to protect yourself and steel yourself as a leader as you're doing this work, right? This kind of showing vulnerability. And this is where we talk about finding people who are confidants, people who don't necessarily have a stake in the leadership that you are trying to exercise in your company, in your constituency, in your community, but people who you can confide in. Right? This is different from people who you might be allied with, who have a common sense of duty with regard to what you're trying to do. So I think there are two separate conversations that both need to happen, but not necessarily using the public narrative framework.
Okay, so our next question comes from Juan Shukri. Juan Shukri, maybe can we unmute you now, and then can you share what country you come from and your question?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yes, I'm from Malaysia. My question, to Ami is, how can we effectively balance between reality, where reality may not be, so good, and also hope, in a situation where there cannot possibly be too much hope. You of course do not want, to end the narrative with a doom and gloom sort of situation, but you do want to, of course, be realistic, but at the same time providing enough hope. So that's my question basically.
Thank you, Juan, for your question. It's a great question. I think when we think about hope, we think about this as this grandiose aspiration, right? One of the examples that I've included in the list of resources at the end of the presentation is from Barack Obama, who literally won a presidential campaign around the concept of hope. But hope doesn't have to be something that's grandiose. It can come in small ways. So one of the ways in which we can think about this is small wins or small victories or small steps, right? Simple solutions that we've engaged with, that we're working with, that can try and make things better in an incremental way. Right? Because we can't just all of a sudden say to everyone, we have to move from a position of fear to a position of hope. The fact of the matter is that fear is probably not going to go away. And our role as leaders isn't to make people fear less, but to help people develop the courage, right, to overcome those fears. And part of doing that is to try and think about small ways, small incremental ways in which we can move the ball, rather than thinking about going from just here, right, where we are to where we want to be. It probably looks more like this, right, with ups and downs along the way.
Okay, thank you, Ami. So our next question comes from Elizabeth Jacob. Elizabeth, can we unmute Elizabeth and allow her to ask her question?
Hi, thanks, John. This is Elizabeth. So I'm Elizabeth from Malaysia, and my question is regarding, the art of telling a story. A lot of leaders, I've been teaching this in part of leadership curriculums for some time, but I am often faced with, in fact, quite a lot, or many leaders actually, who are not comfortable with this approach, either because it's too personal, or they're just not fluent in telling the whole idea that they want to share with the people. So how do we help such leaders? Either because they're just not convinced that it'll help, and not comfortable, kind of telling a story.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and hello. I think this is right. I had tried to speak about this a little bit in my closing remarks, in the sense that there are some people who you might call natural born storytellers, right? They have a gift for being able to share narrative in a way, and not all leaders are going to be like that. It's a tool that leaders can use within their arsenal. But if you think in your position and where you sit that narrative could be a powerful way to move people, one or a couple of ways you might think about it is the message more important than the messenger? Right? So is it possible to have this narrative delivered in a way that will move people, that is not necessarily reliant on a single person? Right? So it could be a narrative that's distributed across several different people, because the narrative still has elements of strategy and analytics to it. So perhaps, if it really, after practice and trial and, kind of determining that this isn't something that is in a particular person's arsenal, perhaps it can be done through a collective of people. And I think it also, we also have to think about what assumptions we're making about the audience that we are interacting with. It could be the case that the narrative might not be compelling to a certain number of people who respond in a certain way. But to the people that this person is trying to move, they might be speaking the same language in terms of their approach to the problem or the ways in which they think they want to make choices to a particular problem. So that would be the suggestion that I would offer, is to think about whether it can be distributed, the narrative can be distributed across multiple people, or about whether this person telling a particular narrative to a particular group of people could be as effective.
Okay, so unfortunately, we're at our very last question, and I want to apologize in advance for all our viewers that have submitted actually very good questions. So our last question is from Ethan Gaines. Can we allow Ethan Gaines into the room and have him ask his question?
Hi. My name is Ethan, coming from Malaysia. So I just wanted to ask this question because I know that we need to move from the self to the us. And a lot of times I think we hear people make this connection a bit too quickly because a lot of people in leadership are in some ways larger than life. So I usually see this worry about suddenly the audience thinks that the leader is pretending to be one of them. So how do we make this connection smoothly? That's my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Ethan, and hello. This is another great question. One of the examples that I've included in the list of resources is a speech that was made by Robert F. Kennedy, just after they found out that Martin Luther King was assassinated, right? He didn't have a script, and this was kind of he was able to produce a public narrative that that moved people. He was at a campaign rally, right? And he's speaking about someone who they share things in common, but he was speaking to an us that was nothing like him, right? At a certain point in his speech, he's speaking to the Black community, and he is not part of that community. So there might be times where you're called to talk about stories of us in which you are not part of that us. It's okay, actually, to not be a part of that us. But I think, if you're in that situation, you have to also dovetail it with the us that you are a part of. So Robert Kennedy talks about the feelings or the emotions for vengeance that the Black community might have, right? Based on what's happened to Martin Luther King. And he ties that into, he might not be someone who is part of that community, but he is part of someone in a community who has had a family member killed, right? So he links an us with a different us. So he makes a bridge in between different us. So if you're concerned about kind of jumping, right, you don't want to seem as a leader to be inauthentically placing yourself in the shoes of someone or in the shoes of a community that you're not part of. But you can use bridges to tie different us's together. That might be one way of combating that sort of leap to trying to be a part of something.
And we will be sending Ami's slides to you just shortly after this webinar session. And you can find the link. It's a very famous speech by Robert Kennedy. I'm so sorry that we have to end right now. I see you, Jesse. I see you, Peter, Rajan, Helmi, Evgenia, and Menkit, and Sharafi. Very good questions. And I'm so sorry we couldn't cover them today, that we just ran out of time. But please do, continue to reach out to us, connect with us on social media for our leadership resources. Maybe you might be able to be lucky if you contact Ami. She might have some time to answer you individually if you have a burning question. So, but before we end, I'd just like to give some announcements. So next week, we will continue our Adaptive Leader webinar series with Daria Estrate who will be joining us from San Francisco. She will be speaking on delivering work while at home, lessons from Silicon Valley. Definitely a very relevant topic during this time. I am also pleased to announce starting June 22 to July 3, and registrations are open starting tomorrow, is we are going to be starting a 2-week online blended learning program led by our president, Samuel Kim. It includes live webinars, cases and assignments, as well as small group coaching. So in the email that you'll be receiving from us within the next 24 hours, you'll get more information about this as well. If you'd like to watch our videos, some of our video courses on Cal Online, they are now all free. One of the most popular ones is Introduction to Leadership by Ami Valdemoro. So please do check that out. It's just free for a limited time, so please do take advantage. I'm also pleased to remind you that our Rethinking Asia series and Asia Leadership Institute series are available for purchase on our website. Ami is actually a contributor for a few of our books, and she talks about adaptive leadership and also how to teach leadership as well. I'd also like to provide an update about our third Asia Leadership Forum, which was originally scheduled for May of this year. It is now scheduled for November 6 in Kuching, Malaysia, and November 9 in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Please do stay tuned for more updates about this event. And lastly, connect with us. So Ami has been generous to share some of her contact information. And please do follow her on LinkedIn, where she does post interesting content. If you'd like to learn about our center, please do visit our website. Our social media platforms are also there, as well as, of course, our email. You can also watch our center's daily adventures on Instagram. And also, you can also see my adventures, maybe not as action-packed as I wish, but quite interesting nevertheless. Please do take the time to do that. We do take it very seriously. We do listen to all of your feedback. We read every single word, actually. And so please do that. So lastly, thank you for all your time today. We hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day. And if you're in the other side of the world, we hope that you have a nice rest. And we do hope that you and your loved ones do stay safe during this time. With that, thank you so much. And we hope to see you again next time.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Stay safe and be well.
Thank you, Ami.